Now, if you're one of those who complains whenever I talk about Sorel, then this definitely isn't the video for you, but I do think almost everyone would benefit from a video like this, as it should leave you with some new knowledge, or at least eschew some past misconceptions. This is intended as a short response to ShortFatOtaku's segment about George Sorel in his video called Socialism is Subversive, which, okay, and aren't all ideologies subversive when they don't have power? To quote a certain individual, ShortFatOtaku, or Dev, is the current year incarnation of Anti-SJW YouTube. He has gathered a large following of about 100,000 enlightened liberal individualists, and from my Twitter engagements with him, I can pretty much confirm that he is exactly what you would expect.
Sternhell also identified George Sorel, or Georges, I can't pronounce French names, guys, as the missing evolutionary link between Marxism and fascism.
The thing with Zeev Sternhell is that he's not really an unbiased writer on fascism or socialism, let alone both. He is an avowed super Zionist, and he was a platoon commander in the Golani Infantry Brigade during the Sinai War. And he was a reservist in the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, and the 1982 Lebanon War. Also, from what he says about Sorel, it is clear that he either only read secondary sources, or he read Sorel's primary works, but didn't really understand them well. Also, here's the thing about secondary sources on George Sorel. Is that I have a story, a big story behind this. I've known about Sorel for a while. He was even mentioned in, I think, one of my first videos, the video on cultural Marxism, and I kind of had the same view that the Dev had. But it wasn't only until about a year ago that I actually started reading his actual writings. Whereas before I had only read secondary sources on him. The reason I became so interested in him was because through reading only secondary sources, in their totality they painted a portrait that was entirely incoherent and contradictory. Some sources said that he was a reactionary who hated modern technology. Others said that he was a traditional moralist who wanted to see some great catastrophe that would birth some Nietzschean new man. And other sources said he was like some sort of a proto-technocratic elitist socialist of the École Polytechnique discipline, only concerned with mechanistic logic. And others that he was an anti-Marxist socialist and a Proudhonian libertarian. And a few others say that he was some sort of Nietzschean catastrophist who exalted the propaganda of the deed and creative violence. With all of this knowledge from secondary sources, there was no other conclusion to come to other than that this man was the Joker. And if I really wanted to understand what he thought, I had to read him for myself. Well, even today, I still find myself trying to face the nonsense of academic study on Sorel. I have learned enough to have sufficient knowledge of his thought. I mean, I talk about the Sorel video, and obviously it's coming, but, you know, I just want it to be perfect, so I'm not going to make the Sorel video until I pretty much have, like, studied and mastered all of his key works. So I would say it might even be in the ballpark of about a year until its release, so, you know. Sorel was definitely a heterodox thinker. Who had his breaks with Marx on things that he considered to be outside of Marx's system, but he always fashioned himself as a true Marxist. Sorel was a pluralist. His socialism was one of self-governing institutions. He was a federalist, but you can see much of what he said echoed in Lenin's conception of a voluntary centralism, which he gives in State and Revolution. Stemming from his pluralism, Sorel was also a voluntarist, believing association by conviction to be the ultimate form of organizing social life, as opposed to monistic capitalist plutocracies or a socialist ministerialist democracy. Also, from the poor quality fragments of the socialist future of the syndicates that I have acquired, one of his writings on the status of women indicate that he was some sort of feminist.
Sorel was a syndicalist who, after observing that the proletariat did not actually rise up in revolt when called upon to fight the First World War, declared Marxism a failure.
There is no writing or letter or anything of Sorel's where he declares Marxism to be a failure for the lack of a proletarian revolt, let alone during the outbreak of the First World War. My guess as to where Dev got this from is this clip from a Tick video.
The other great powers became embroiled in the First World War, the Marxist theory of the proletariat going on strike in opposition to the war, igniting a revolution or stopping the war from starting in the first place, didn't take hold. In fact, the opposite had happened. The socialists and the proletariat had supported their own national governments.
Amazing, great research there, buddy. The only thing in Sorel's writings that comes close to saying Marx's proletarian revolt to be a failure is when he speaks about social peace, a development Marx had not foreseen. In Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels does say that the bourgeoisie has rarely wielded direct political power, and that when they do, it creates periods of decadence. But the idea of a bourgeoisie that seeks to weaken its own strength was not something that had developed during their time. The two antagonistic classes therefore influence each other in a partly indirect but decisive manner. Capitalism drives the proletariat into revolt because in daily life the employers use their force in a direction opposed to the desire of their workers. But the future of the proletariat is not entirely dependent on this revolt. The working classes are organized under the influence of other causes, and socialism, inculcating in them the revolutionary idea, prepares them to suppress the hostile class. A capitalist force is at the base of all of this process, and its action is automatic and inevitable. Marx supposed that the bourgeoisie had no need to be incited to employ force. But we are today faced with a new and very unforeseen fact: a bourgeoisie which seeks to weaken its own strength. Must we believe that the Marxian conception is dead? By no means, for proletarian violence comes upon the scene just as the moment when the conception of social peace is being held up as a means of moderating disputes. Proletarian violence confines employers to their role of producers and tends to restore the separation of the classes, just when they seemed on the point of intermingling in the democratic march.
Sorel discovered that the proletariat is always the most reactionary force in any society, and considered Marx to be incorrect about the revolutionary potential.
In saying that Sorel broke with Marxism on the issue of revolutionary potential because he believed the proletariat was the most conservative and reactionary class instead of a progressive revolutionary one, it is clear that Dev is referring to Sorel's conception of revolutionary preservation. In order to understand thoroughly the consequences of the very singular regime in the midst of which we are living, we must hark back to Marx's conception of the passage from capitalism to socialism. These conceptions are well known, yet we must constantly return to them, because they are often forgotten, or at least undervalued by official socialist writers. It is necessary to insist on them strongly each time that we have to argue about the anti-Marxist transformation which contemporary socialism is undergoing. According to Marx, capitalism, by reason of the innate laws of its own nature, is hurrying along a path which will lead the world of today with the inevitability of the evolution of organic life to the doors of the world of tomorrow. This movement comprises a long period of capitalistic construction, and it ends by a rapid destruction, which is the work of the proletariat. Capitalism creates the heritage which socialism will receive, the men who will suppress the present regime, and the means of bringing about this destruction, at the same time that it preserves the results obtained in production. And in the footnotes he says, this notion of revolutionary preservation is very important. I have pointed out something analogous in the passage from Judaism to Christianity, in the historical system of Renan, in page 72 to 73, 171 to 172, and 467, if you're interested. This is actually a common source of confusion. Because of this concept of revolutionary preservation, Sorel is attributed to the conservative revolution, with thinkers like Spengler, Sombart, and the Strasser brothers. And Spengler does at least mention Sorel once in his writings. I forget which one, though. And it does seem like him and many others have the misconception that Sorel's revolutionary preservation means a destruction of capitalist production, which would return industry to pre-capitalist artisan production, but this isn't the case. Sorel says himself that the revolution would preserve the results obtained in production. What he is talking about here is scientific management, or Taylorism, which was the domineering trend in industrial production during his time. He isn't talking about the workers burning down the factories and then going to the wheat fields to get a tradwife. The concept of revolutionary preservation isn't really even that unique. It's just basically putting in explicit words what Marx had said in Critique of the Gotha program. What we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus, in every aspect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges.
Sorel also correctly recognized that the proletariat are often driven to act when they believe in a collective mythos, whether that be the state, or the people, or the religion.
Sorel's conception of myth is a descriptive observation of the fact that all great social movements believe themselves to have an eventual ultimate catastrophic victory. It has nothing to do with a mass belief in a grand abstraction as the guiding force behind action. Sorel declares the catastrophic general strike of the proletariat to be a myth, and juxtaposes that to the utopias of certain French socialists of his time. As opposed to utopias which motivate people to construct some social blueprint in isolation from the conditions of present society, revolutionary myth motivates people to act in accordance with the discipline of historical materialism, and that they work towards a catastrophic collapse of capitalist production, which the future socialist society emerges out of. Sorel's conception of myth here is a materialist one, nothing to do with folklore or grand abstractions as social movers. To proceed scientifically means, first of all, to know what forces exist in the world, and then to take measures whereby we may utilize them, by reasoning from experience. That is why I say that, by accepting the idea of the general strike, although we know that it is a myth, we are proceeding exactly as a modern physicist does, who has complete confidence in his science, although he knows that the future will look upon it as antiquated. It is we who really possess the scientific spirit, while our critics have lost touch with both modern science and modern philosophy. And having proved this, we are quite easy in our minds. A modern-day example of a revolutionary myth would be Samir Amin's decoupling of the Third World from the world market, causing a catastrophe in the global capitalist system. Something that is pretty much universally accepted in anti-imperialist circles, consciously or unconsciously. You can juxtapose this myth against the utopia of Vosch's grand commonwealth of market socialist co-ops, and see what side actually wants meaningful social change, and what side just makes vague pronouncements to it.
Sorel spent much of his life advocating for socialism achieved through his conception of national syndicalism.
Now, Sorel never called himself a national syndicalist, and to my knowledge, he's never even used the words. National syndicalism was used by Sorel Proudhon, which was established by his associates Edward Berth and Georges Valois to describe the synthesis achieved by disaffected revolutionary syndicalists from the CGT going in alliance with Action Française, and their the integral nationalism of Charles Maurras. The trend of national syndicalism, or corporative syndicalism, from Sorel Proudhon was a sort of proto-fascism, but shouldn't be understood as some hidden bridge to fascism, and more of a trend that highlighted the tendency of those in the ideological open tent of revolutionary syndicalism to move towards nationalism, and become national syndicalists, and about a decade later becoming partisan fascists. There are a lot of events that happen between the establishment of Sorel Proudhon to the formation of the Italian National Fascist Party, and also from that to the March on Rome. The Sorel Proudhon and Action Française days were really a depressive withdrawal from politics for Sorel, and he never made any meaningful contribution to the movement. Also, Sorel Proudhon never produced any coherent doctrine, so they can't really be said to be as great of an influence on the development of fascism as Dev makes them out to be. Fascism made something out of Sorel Proudhon. Sorel Proudhon didn't really make much of it out of fascism.
And both Mussolini and Lenin are considered equal successors to Sorelian thought, for doing what Sorel described as the union of the national and the social, something I have studied without ever developing the idea. Sorel's philosophy, acting as the bridge between Marxism and fascism, is more extensively explored in James Miesel's article, A Premature Fascist, published in the Western Political Quarterly, Volume 3, Number 1, March 1950.
Now, A Premature Fascist, Sorel and Mussolini by James Miesel, was actually an article I sent to Dev to refute his position, but then he began quote mining it to confirm his own beliefs, and declared that it agreed with him. The quote where Sorel praises Mussolini, that he puts in his video, is even explained by the author when he points out that as late as April 1920, Mussolini was making anarchist pronouncements. The other thing is, if you read the whole article, Sorel says a lot of things about fascism depending on who he is writing letters to. At one point, he says the true chief of the fascists is the king, without evidence. He says that the rise of fascism is another Thermidorian reaction. He calls on the socialists to work with the government against the fascists, breaking his grand taboo. He says that the way the fascists treat the Italian socialists is like how the black and tans treat the Sinn Féiners. And at one point he also calls Italian nationalists street Arabs. So, I don't know, take that as you will. The author suggests that while it is clear Sorel held personal animosity towards fascism, that shortly before his death, Sorel, as a social scientist, began to think differently of fascism from being a standard reactionary movement. As the author writes, the intellectual attitude of Sorel, the social scientist, would have loved nothing better than to accommodate Sorel, the sympathizer with organized labor, by relegating the new phenomena, fascism, to the camp of counter-revolution. But somehow it would not work. The Thermidorian Mussolini defied the scheme of the Reflections. He continued to flout all the rules of the game, by reviling monarchy, by threatening the church, and in parliament by consistently voting with his enemies against his friends. Was it possible that he, the anti-socialist, might yet help socialism to win its battle? Not a few Italian radicals thought so at the time. On April 18, 1921, Sorel quoted, without comment, a speculation of his Italian friend Miseroli to the effect that socialists and fascists might arrive at an understanding and unite in a Republican front. The day the call for the Republic would be sounded forcefully and taken up in earnest by the socialists, that day would see the end of all resistance. So what is clear is that Sorel, like Lenin, praised Mussolini as a socialist, but then when the black shirts started repressing socialists and working with landlords to put down peasant strikes, he thought of fascism as a reactionary movement, which he held animosity towards. But later in 1921, he, as an intellectual, begins to develop a different view of fascism, and then he just fucking dies, leaving us with a confused mess. What Sorel would think of fascism when it became triumphant, we will sadly never know. Oh, and Dev, if you want to know what position the author is actually arguing for, just go down to the end, where you will read this. Mindful of his own definition of class reconciliation as the idee matrice of democracy, exactly the idea which he considered as a sign of decadence. Sorel today would probably term fascism a perverted form of mass democracy. Its elite, with all its outward insistence on the Sorelian virtues of thrift, austerity, and heroism, would appear to be a group of Catilinarian characters rallying around a master demagogue who, in the black shirt of a 20th century little corporal, was imposing on his nation a plebiscitary sham of democracy, while adapting the distributive welfare state of our time to the standards of Italian poverty. Nothing was so distasteful to Sorel as the equalitarianism of the dole, and he never tired of distinguishing the revolution of the modern industrial proletariat from the eternal mass rebellion of the poor. If he hated democracy because it tended, in his view, to corrupt the worker by lifting him up to the level of a bourgeois sloth, he should have hated even more a regime that leveled all distinctions downward, transforming the classes into a great mob. The title of the article poses a question: was Sorel a premature fascist? The author very consistently argues that the answer to that is no.
Here is how things read when you don't simply stop as soon as your preconceived biases are confirmed.
Now, what does Dev get right in his video? He is correct in saying that Big F fascism, the ideology of the National Fascist Party, is a concise doctrine in that it pronounces what it sees as a revolutionary form of nationalism, premised on the ontology of actual idealism, as conceived by Gentile. Now, obviously, fascism was conceived in part by a drift of socialists towards nationalism, but to say what became of fascism to be socialism is quite ridiculous. Fascism takes concepts from socialism, such as syndicalism, industrial democracy, and council republicanism, but synthesizes them with corporatist thought and purposes them for nationalist empire building, and not a proletarian dictatorship for building socialism. Oh, and Dev should be hurt to find out that many of the OG fascists actually used to be liberals, such as Italo Balbo, who was a Republican and also a Freemason. Sorel's guilty part in fascism is that he was a prominent intellectual that was frequently discussed in circles of people who would later become fascists. To say as Dev does that Sorel is the dark wizard in his castle using unholy Nazgul magic to manifest the doctrine of fascism into being is erroneous and a most annoying and pervasive misconception.
The time has come, as I promised. The time when I reveal to you, my loyal followers, the ancient secret of war. The key to creating hysteria, fear, gods. Behold!
absolutely return to Sorel's philosophy in a future video, because there is some interesting stuff in there.
Awesome. That's great to hear. I'm looking forward to that one. Let me tell you.
I must avenge my father's death.
It ain't no fairyland out there, kid. But all right. I was just testing you.
Well?
Well, what?
Well, what now?
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, why don't you sit there for a couple hours while I figure it out?
Okay.